70s.
Yes.
Well, the person who was arguing sounds like.
And he's even been visited by Mr. Quintesca.
Really?
Yeah.
He hasn't been involved in furry anime conventions, but he started the first. He was one of the group of people who started the first anime fan club.
A lot of people in that club eventually started importing.
Okay.
Although
You guys might
Peter
be,
Chung was a member.
I think you guys might be bigger experts than me in some areas then, so I will, so welcome to the convention history panel. This is a panel I've been doing a lot in the last 2 years. I've been working on the convention history book for a while now. It's actually, I think about 7 years I've been working on this book. The problem is, it's been very, very hard to find the ending point, because once I find exactly where I end to end the book, new things develop within the convention scene, which seems, oh, that's the perfect place, that's the perfect place. So I've been trying to raise money for this book for the last few years. I promoted this at San Diego Comic-Con. In fact, the Comic-Con Museum is trying to use the basis of this book as their timeline for their museum, because they basically told me, we have the location, we have the museum, but we don't have the timeline.
Cut in real quick. You see there's a museum of fan conventions.
There's actually not a museum for fan conventions, but Comic-Con specifically has their own museum. And they were using my timeline as kind of a basis to build their timeline on. So this is the book I've been working on. The working title, I'm still using Conquest as a title because I think it's a clever word pun, but I think I'll develop a better title as I go along.
No, I like it.
Yeah. A little bit of history about myself. I went to military academy. I went to Johns Hopkins University. There I wrote a lot of history books. One of my first history books was called The West Point in the West. It was a history book about the history of military schools in America in general. Before then, there's actually never been a book written on American military schools. There have been books written on specific military schools, but not military schools in general. So I wanted to take this idea and do it. So this basically led me to the Convention History Project, because while there might have been books written on specific cons and specific fandoms, there's never been an overall arching narrative. And the problem is different fandoms like to fight against each other and not consider each other part of the same structure. So anime fans, furries, sci-fi fans, bronies, they might not all see each other as helping with this long DNA chain that make them up, but every single part is connected with each other. And in fact, if you guys want to, the flyers are up here, and I actually have the little division of my book in the back if you guys want to check that out later. But, so this is a rough family tree that I came up with last year as I was trying to piece together the different timelines, and I kind of want to start right here. So there's a nebulous area. I'm going to use the Victorian era as the starting point, even though the prologue of my book traces fandoms all the way back to shamanic cavemen telling stories and retelling stories around the fire circles for generations and generations. But our modern idea of fandom is when culture became popular. In fact, we think of these conventions as pop culture conventions. What is popular culture? It is culture, stories that are accessible to the mass media. The problem with stories are, for the longest time, most stories, painting, and art were held for the rich and the nobles. Only the royalty could afford to see plays. Only the royalty could have court jesters. Only the royalty could have these expensive handwritten books. But as printing became cheaper and more accessible, we started to see the rise of the middle-class fan. Specifically, Jane Austen was one of the first to write specifically for the middle class. No longer writing for the upper class, but writing for the middle class. And eventually, as printing became cheaper, as storytelling, as plays became cheaper, and as new mediums started to evolve, from cinema to comics to television, we all of a sudden see the shift from stories being aimed for the upper middle classes to the lower classes. In a sense, pop culture became popular, and that's where the idea of pop culture fandoms exploded. Around the Victorian era and Edwardian period, we had a lot of this in the terms with Sherlock Holmes fandom being one of the good examples. They have a lot of early hallmarks that we could lay on to modern day fandoms, including having names for characters who are connected together, having terms that only fans would know, having a mailing list where they could write each other and have these little zines they could send to each other. They could send each other their own headcanons, their own fan fictions, their own fan theories. Basically, the first internet forum were done by Sherlock Holmes fans and the fans of Jane Austen and other Victorian works, sending letters and mails to each other. So what's a convention? The problem is you can't define a convention. It's very, very tricky. Are Renaissance fairs technically conventions? Are trade shows technically conventions? Well, to make things very, very simple, I'm using my starting point of the family tree with Worldcon. I'm using Worldcon as defining the first convention because of simple parameters. First, Worldcon was the first event as opposed to earlier meetings where you had authors meet with fans and fans meet together and talk about their works. Most of these things were one-day meetings. They didn't really go that long. People just came to town for about one day to talk about their favorite fandoms or to talk with the author they like. The concept of staying at a hotel together for 3 days, interacting, mingling, and putting a schedule behind it, that's probably what I would say is the hallmark that's been carried over to every single convention since then. So using that basis, Worldcon is easily seen as the first convention, if not the first prototypical convention. Now, the interesting about Worldcon and the sci-fi cons that were born out of this area is sci-fi cons were mainly fans for the fan type conventions where it was the fandom inviting the industry into its abode. So these were people who were fans of people who worked in the industry. So the professional writers, artists, people who worked in film, cinema, media. They were inviting these people as the guests of honor to these events. Nowadays we have multimedia conventions like Comic-Con and anime cons that have headlines of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of guests of honor. But at sci-fi cons and furry cons, we normally see one guest of honor. In most sci-fi con cases, it is one industry guest and one fandom guest. Now, the point with the industry guest is they are seen as, like I said, inviting someone who they admire, who created this content, into the abode of the fandom. Now, on the other hand, we have what I call pro conferences. So this is where I would say the Comic-Cons kind of devolved from. So pro conferences, I would say, are conventions that were actually made by people who are either working in the industry or profit off the industry, and they are inviting the fandom into its abode. So the very first Comic-Cons I could trace back to even before New York Comic Con. But New York Comic Con, I would say, is considered the first modern convention, and the New York Comic Con of 1964 is very, very different than the modern day New York Comic Con. Two completely different entities, same name. Now, what led to the conventions were the concept of local comic book stores building up a lot of backstock that they needed to sell off eventually. So a lot of these comic book artists and comic book stores would gather together and have one-day like swap shows where they would try to sell these rows of books. Sci-fi cons also had the concept of having an area where dealers could sell things. Normally, dealers would sell old books or memorabilia from TV shows that they like Doctor Who or Star Trek, but there was never really an industry to sell stuff at sci-fi cons back in the day. The idea of using cons to sell things really came when the comic book store owners really wanted to get rid of their extra backstock and invite fans to do that. Now, unlike the sci-fi cons, which invited one guest of honor, Comic-Cons, again, they wanted to make money, so they didn't want to pay money to have a lot of famous people come into their event. So what they did is created the concept of the Artist Alley, where they could invite people who worked in the comic book industry, say, hey, we'll give you a table if we're allowed to put your name in our brochures, and you can make whatever money you want signing books and doing on-site commissions. So there we have the concept of the Artist Alley. And like I said, it was industry people inviting the fandom into its abode as opposed to the sci-fi con scene. Now, this is going to be interesting because we have the birth of the Artist Alley at the Comic-Con, but we also have artist alleys and anime cons, but they're two completely different artist alleys that are going to coexist for a while until anime cons become very, very popular in America, and now we have the same term for two totally different concepts. Now, let's continue. I'm going to go through a little bit of the history of the sci-fi cons and then kind of get closer to the concept of the anime con. So basically this covered all the stuff I was just talking about. Now the next thing that we have, what would naturally evolve from sci-fi cons, or if comic cons were specifically run by the professional industries and publishers to try to sell more and promote more of their works, the exact opposite reaction to that would be underground indie comic artists trying to sell their works. So it's no coincidence that around the same time as the counterculture movement happening in America, so there was a famous underground comics group called the Texas Mafia that moved to San Francisco and basically created the underground comic boom. We saw big people who used to work for Marvel Comics like Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby leave Marvel to pursue their own independent works. So there was a shift against the comic book industry around this time, more towards indie creators. So we started to see a boom of indie creators expanding this concept of the artist alley and now trying to promote their own independent work. Across the ocean around the same time, Japan was doing something very similar. So remember when I said culture became popular when people had the ability to produce the books that are acceptable to the upper, middle, and lower classes? Well, you could say fandoms became popular when that printing ability, that communication ability became now accessible to the lower classes as well. So in the in the 20s, we started to see a rise of what's called fanzines and something called the Tijuana Bible. These were cheap little magazines or cheap little 10-page comics that fans of shows like Popeye or movie stars like Humphrey Bogart or science fiction characters like Flash Gordon, they could do their own little 10-page comics of these characters, basically the first published fan fictions. Back before the copyright laws were really solidified, you were allowed to do this legally. Now, that adds an issue because a lot of these Tijuana Bibles are notorious for being mostly adult smut. So 90% of all these Tijuana Bibles were smut. So the idea that fan art and fan fiction being lewd and adult as a modern concept, no, it's, as long as fan fiction has been around, there's always been lewdness in fan fiction. Now, Japan developed its own equivalent to the Tijuana Bible in the form of a dondenshi. A dondenshi is very similar, a 10 to 20 page comic that took popular manga or anime characters around this time and they produced their own little things. Similar to the underground comic conventions, they started to have their own little gatherings where artists would sell their own works, their own independent fan art. Specifically, the main one that became the basis for later conventions was Comiket. And what's interesting is it wasn't called Anime-Ket or Manga-Ket, it was called Comiket. It took the carryover name from the Comic Cons and essentially created what was one giant artist alley where people would sell fan work of their favorite characters. So now, the second Comic Con was, the term artist alley was coined, as opposed to the first artist alley, which were specifically for professionals working in the industry who had license and IP to work on these characters. You now had an entire movement of a convention artist alley where near 100% of the things being sold were fan art. This becomes an issue when anime cons become more popular in America. But in the meantime, I need to introduce you guys to the next important fandom, the Star Trek fandom. Now, in the book, I do cover a lot of fandoms, but two fandoms in particular, two fandoms that are based on a specific franchise get notable mention because of their impact they had on the convention scene. These are going to be the Star Trek fans, or the Trekkies, and the My Little Pony fans, or the Bronies, specifically because of what they've done to the convention scene. I'm going to talk about those Trekkies first, because a lot of the modern techniques that we have in running conventions and how we see fandoms got developed in the Star Trek fandom. The concept of Slash, like I said, has been around for a while, but Slash became more popularized, and in fact, a lot of the terms we have, shipping, Slash, really started appearing around the time of the Star Trek fandom. Gene Roddenberry actually announces his new show at a convention, and there we get the aspect that the convention scene can have an impact on the industry. Remember what I said, it was the fandom inviting the industry into its abode, or it's the industry inviting the fandom to its abode. Because of this is going to be the few times where you have the mingling of the professional world and the fan world together. Before then, the only time you could really communicate with these people were through fan letters. It's not until we have Twitter now where we can have instant communication. The only time fans of a property could meet the people who created the property were at these conventions. And so announcing new works, announcing new properties at the convention is a great way to get the word out. And we see this continue nowadays to multimedia events like San Diego Comic-Con, announcing their new movies over and over again. But this is one of the first early testaments of how the convention scene is slowly having an impact on the industry. The term Trekkie was coined, and this is also where we see the idea of the stereotypical convention attendee, where William Shatner famously yells to the in a Saturday Night Live skit, yells to the Trekkies, get a life, because they're too, it says, too involved with this community. Now, there's been excessive fans before this. The difference is, now we have the aspect of television and local news channels. Local news channels are getting big. What are they going to do when there's a weird convention in town? They're going to go there, they're going to film it. What are the people going to see? They're going to see people talking in weird languages and weird tongues. They're going to see people dressed weird. So this is where we get the shift that has been kind of influencing culture for the next half century, where fans of comics, fans of superheroes, fans of sci-fi are seen as geeky, nerdy man-children with no life. It was because of the news reports of these events, now that news is becoming popular with local news channels, and the skits and comedies that we see parodied in shows like Saturday Night Live, influencing this. Of course, Trekkies are famously one of the few fandoms to have a unique term coined for themselves. You're going to see this continue with a lot of different fandoms where new fandoms pop up and carry over a lot of the same terminology. I also wanted to point out, I think I missed it before, but folk music also started becoming developed in the science fiction cons around this time. And what's interesting is we could even say that folk music is the ancestor to modern music we see at cons. The concerts, the hallway raves, the DJs playing randomly could all descend from folk music. But what folk music was, well, first of all, it was a misspelling of the word folk music. But what they would do is they would find empty panel rooms, gather the chairs into a circle. One guy would randomly start strumming a guitar, singing about one of their favorite science fiction heroes. They would riff songs on the spot. People would join in circles and gather. And there's where you basically get what will eventually be the Anime Con hallway DJ, where people will just be randomly setting up their DJ booth and start singing, eventually evolving to the raves and concert. Now, if we look back at the family tree, because this started developing halfway through the timeline of the science fiction cons, you see only cons that descend from science fiction cons, like anime cons, furry cons, and pony cons, continue the tradition of music, while comic cons, which never had the concept of folk music in its history, never actually developed these things organically. In fact, I don't think there's actually any Comic Con that has any major concert or music scene. It's all from cons that descend from science fiction cons. I could quickly pass through a lot of these things, but basically we did see a lot of changes through culture around this time. So we could easily say in almost every single medium, animation, television, comics, and literature were boiled down into three periods around this time. You had a Bronze Age, a Dark Age, and a Renaissance period. Why this is important is because almost every single form, science fiction, went through a change where it stagnated. It had to have new work, Neuromancer, wake it up before it shifted to a new category. Comics had a similar thing and went through the Bronze Age before Alan Moore woke it up with Watchmen and shifted it to a more darker age. While in America, Western cartoon shows were falling to a similar path. The Hanna-Barbera style, making animation cheaper, started becoming the new norm until Disney was inspired by a lot of the Miyazaki works and Japanese works to try to relive that glory day of the old Golden Age Renaissance of animation and produce Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast in this new period known as the Disney Renaissance. Vice versa, in television, you had something very, very similar where John Kay wanted to look back at the old Golden Age classic cartoon shows and make them lively again instead of stiff. And we saw what's known as the animation renaissance in television. Now, why this is important is because it started to fast forward the pace of how animation became more introduced to America. Now, animation has been dubbed in America many times. In fact, before it was called anime, it was known as Japanimation. And normally it was only the West Coast cities that would normally get the first Japanimation dubs. Hawaii and California were normally the test markets for Japanimation. It wasn't until science fiction cons started expanding their room parties where anime eventually got its term, where otaku eventually became the colloquial term. In fact, I think the term otaku descends from a science fiction con in Japan. But you start to see room parties now playing a major influence in how these cons were formed. So science fiction cons, if you guys ever been to a science fiction con, you'll know they're famous for their party floors. What's unique about science fiction cons are, before we had comic cons, before we had anime cons, before we had furry, brony, trek cons, science fiction used to be a nebulous term for just all pop culture in general. It was a science fiction con was the convention. If you were a fan of superheroes, you go to a science fiction con. If you're a Doctor Who fan, you go to a science fiction con. If you're a fan of Astro Boy, you go to a science fiction cons. So if you're at a con, how are you going to meet people who are like-minded fans? This is why the room parties started developing in a way where you could meet these fans easier. The bulletin board in a lobby is a hallmark of almost every science fiction con. If you go to Worldcon or any small science fiction con around the world, if it's over 20 years old, you'll see normally they're small enough to take place in one hotel, and normally in that lobby of the hotel you'll have a whiteboard or a dry erase board where someone would say, if you're a Doctor Who fan, come to room 205 at 8 p.m. and we'll watch a lot of Doctor Who. Essentially, room parties started this way and became really, really big as different genres started growing. Now, people would start noticing, okay, we don't have a fandom, we like anthropomorphic animals, but we don't specifically know why. Eventually, people started realizing, oh, so I like Looney Tunes, you like Robin Hood, you like this weird, obscure manga, you like this, you like cereal mascots, okay, maybe let's try to gather together. Or if you like Astro Boy and you like Akira, there must be some type of connecting thing. So you started seeing room parties formed around genres becoming really, really big. Room parties formed around genres are, of course, going to be really big to the point that they're going to overflow and no longer contain them, to the point where we are big enough that we don't need to be a room party anymore. We can form our own conventions. So you started to see, in the 90s, anime cons becoming really, really big in America, and eventually furry cons. Anime cons, when they came to America, took a lot of the same terminology that Comiket has, so they adopted the idea of a fan artist alley and reported that to America. Now there's an issue, because at anime con artist alleys, you're allowed to sell fan art. At Comic Con artist alleys, it's looked down upon. In fact, you might get hit with a lawsuit. So the fact that there's 2 American artist alleys happening at cons cause a lot of issues, especially when bronies and furries start adapting the term artist alleys for their conventions. Of course, we have the early furry cons. This is, of course, where you guys come into play. So, like we were saying, anthropomorphic artwork is probably the oldest art we have. In fact, you could stretch it and say furries are the oldest fan that we have. If you look at our very first art, our first cave paintings, our first statues, were all half human, half animal drawings, caricatures. So something that should be the most broad fandom somehow has become stigmatized to the public. Why? Well, I think it has a lot of hallmarks of what happened with the Trekkies and everything else. So, like we were saying, anthropomorphic fans started realizing we are fans of the same media. Hey, let's do room parties together. Hey, wait a minute, let's start coining terms. Okay, here's a new term, furry. Oh wait, here's a new term, fursuit. Instead of calling them mascots, so let's call them fursuits. Oh wait, fursona. So we started seeing the terms, which I'm sure you guys know very, very well. There are specific moments in room parties where a lot of these new terms that we now know for the furry fandom have become coined and adapted into the nomenclature. Now, sci-fi cons started having big room parties dedicated to furries. So, of course, even San Diego Comic-Con, WesterCon, WorldCon would have furry parties that dominated the scene to the point they grew so big that the local furries can now expand and try to do their own convention. Conference, I believe is the first furry con. Is that correct? All right.
Correct.
So I am correct in that case.
Before you go on, can I jump in real quick here?
Yeah.
Your second point there, you've got some dates right, but you've got some locations wrong. Allow me to add that. 1985, first furry-themed room party was at WesterCon Sacramento.
Ah, Sacramento.
Yes. When WesterCon 86 was the first party referred to as a furry party.
Furry party.
That was in San Diego.
All right.
Yes.
Before that, they were prancing skill tier.
Okay, so I have some corrections to do.
California happened many years later.
Yeah. So,
Just letting you know.
okay, perfect. That's why I need you guys here to help fill in the
They
blanks.
will trade telegrams.
So, I was not around during the period where the furry fandom got started, but seeing my research of how the news portrayed furries, mirroring how the news portrayed Trekkies, I have some ideas and theories of how eventually furries became stigmatized. So like I was saying, the local news station broadcasting local news became popularized around the same time Trek cons started becoming popular. So around the same time Furry cons started becoming popular, we saw again that same boost of local news. What do they want to research? Well, we've already done to death the Comic Cons. People dressing up as superheroes, that gets boring now. People dressing up as stormtroopers, that gets boring now. So a lot of the old news reports I see at the first Furry Cons, obviously we're looking down at furries. Okay, what's this? People are dressing up as animals. This is kind of odd. This is kind of weird. This is kind of making fun of them. They're completely different than the comic and anime con people that we were looking at. And unfairly, I think furries have been labeled as the adult not safe for work fan convention, even though anime cons sell body pillows and dockies and not safe for work comics, they're called the virgin man children. So I think it is highly unfair. So the issue was, because the media, local media, was portraying furries in such a negative light, a lot of cons shifted to the position that, okay, we do need to have at least a vetted media or a blackout on media. Please do not invite media. Media, you're not invited. Do not come. If you do work for media and kind of report on us, we're going to have to ban you because we need to protect the image. Now, this causes a little bit of an issue because while Trekkies still at least had the media there, they were able to play it up as, again, being lovable, dorky fans. Because the media was no longer invited to a lot of these early furry cons, instead of drawing attention away from them, it got the opposite. What are they doing in there that justifies a media blackout? Why can't we report on them? Why can't we see them? So of course you're going to have rumors and theories, the whole entire secret society notion of it must be doing something really, really bad at these cons if we are not allowed to be there. And that, I think, perpetuated this entire fear notion that furry cons were something worse than what they should be. And at the same time, I think that's when furry cons also cut themselves off from the timeline of the other cons. When I started doing this panel, I used to say if you want to look at an old school science fiction con from the 90s, go no further than your local furry con, because a lot of the same hallmarks of how science fiction cons were run in the 90s, the exact same structure of the room panels, how they did registration, how they accepted people for dealers, were almost identical. So while anime cons, science fiction cons, and comic cons would eventually start sharing staff and having similar overlap and started sharing ideas of how to improve themselves, certain regions of furry cons kept themselves slightly isolated, only intermingling with other furry cons to the extent that they had a completely different trajectory in that evolutionary tree where they weren't able to continue and advance. And I don't think it's really until like the last 5 years that a lot of these furry cons started picking up the same ideas that anime cons, pony cons, and comic cons started adapting in the mid-2000s. Now, this becomes an issue where I'm going to just fast forward to when I think the shift happened. Comic cons, furry cons, anime cons, sci-fi cons, highly stigmatized, made fun of in public. It doesn't matter which medium it was, Saturday Night Live, Lucky Star, you see negative portrayals of how fandoms were portrayed. Of course, we had a famous CSI episode about furries. So my theory is, I noticed a boom in ticket sales at San Diego Comic-Con after a specific point in the timeline. And I looked back at it and noticed 2 movies came out a specific year. San Diego started seeing a spike in ticket sales. Because, believe it or not, there used to be a time where you could almost buy a ticket the day of San Diego Comic-Con and walk up to the conventions. Now they sell out in minutes. So what happened? Well, 2 important movies happened around the same time. Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan, where Heath Ledger won an Oscar, one of the first superhero movies to win an Oscar, and Iron Man. So while I think Dark Knight is more artistically better, I think Iron Man had a bigger impact. Here's the thing. At Comic Cons, who were they still inviting as their comedian guests, as their guests of honor? They're always inviting old school people who work in the industry. Your Stan Lees, your Grant Morrisons. They didn't really have new people that other people would be interested in. Because until recently, the public didn't really care about Stan Lee. Who? Oh, he made superheroes? Okay. Comic book artists, comic book writers were not seen as mainstream. Now, you had a Hollywood actor, Robert Downey Jr., come to Comic-Con on a Sunday to announce he's working on a new Iron Man movie. Now, this is interesting because, like we were saying, the industry and the fans, they only intermingle at one point, at this point, conventions, now you have Hollywood intermingling with fans at conventions. Because the general public, the only time you could really see Hollywood actors is if you kind of stalk them out in Hollywood or LA and do the star tours. The fact that you can now go to a con and there's a chance you can meet a Hollywood actor, I think really, really changed the game, where now it became popular to, okay, maybe we could go to this con, maybe we might see Robert Downey Jr. next year. And then that led to boom in ticket sales. That then led to, oh, our promotion of Iron Man with Robert Downey Jr. went over really, really well. Let's start promoting new properties at this con, and like how Gene Roddenberry promoted Star Trek at the early science fiction cons, which really got the ball rolling for the Trekkie fandom, we started having movie studios now promoting their new properties. And all of a sudden, Comic-Con ticket sales started booming, and likewise, the amount of cons that were created started booming. You started seeing companies that started corporatizing cons, and everyone started moving upwards, and all of a sudden, geek became chic, and geek culture and nerd culture became popular. You started seeing podcasts, YouTube shows, you started seeing loot box, new crates, Funko. People started aiming for these fan scenes. And all of a sudden, the concept of being a geek is no longer seen as nerdy, it is now filling and blowing up the comic scene. That doesn't mean we've evolved past the point where we don't stigmatize new fandoms and new folks. Because another fandom started popping up around the same time, My Little Pony, the oddest of the fandoms, and in fact, I would say it's even more unique than the Star Trek cons, because while Star Trek cons host all generations of Star Trek, you could like the new J.J. Abrams Star Trek, you could like the old ones. My Little Pony is weird because there's 4 versions of My Little Pony, but the fans only gather for one version of My Little Pony, and that changes things a lot. So the founder of the first BronyCon, Purple Tinker, she was a big fan. She was a furry, and she's a Star Trek fan. So she looked at how Star Trek cons are run, and she looked at how furry cons are run, and made a hybrid version for her first PonyCon. Now, there's a difference, she noticed. While the Star Trek fandoms, they could pull their guest list from any generation of the show. They could pull it from new to the next generation. They could pull some random background actor from the first Star Trek serial. Ponies, it's going on. The first BronyCon was held in 2011. The show just started airing in 2010. There's only 6 main characters in the show, voiced by 4 voice actresses. So you have a small pool of people to pull from. All of a sudden, it becomes tight competition if you want to recruit these people. And also, the bad thing is, if your con messes up, this voice actress, she's going to be in the studio with the other voice actresses the next weekend. And she's going to blab that your con was annoying, so they're never going to go to your cons again. So not only does the pony fandom have a smaller pool of guests to pull from, they also have the risk of the show still running. We have to stay in good terms and good graces with this. And that led to an issue, because PonyCon started booming. While you might say Lord of the Rings fandom, Harry Potter fandom, Steven Universe fandom, SpongeBob fandoms might be bigger than the Brony fandom, there's been more BronyCons than Twilight, Harry Potter, and Doctor Who cons at the same time. At one point, there was almost 50 PonyCons happening around the United States alone. Almost every major metropolitan area had like 3 PonyCons popping up at once. And if they're fighting over these same 4 voice actresses, this becomes a problem. A good example is Unicon. Unicon is the turning point, I'd say, not just for the Brony fandom, but for the entire convention scene, modern convention scene, fan-run convention scene at this point. Unicon almost messed up. Oh, they did mess up. They invited so many guests, so many show staff in its one place, and all of a sudden, they realized, oh, we couldn't pay the staff. Oh, we're not using money, real money in our dealer's hall. You have to exchange it for these fun bucks, and you can change it, the dealers could change it for money back. And all of a sudden, it went downhill. What's interesting is a fandom about friendship, the Brony fandom, was kind of fighting around this time. Everyone wanted to be the dominant position in the Brony fandom. But when they saw that this con was sinking, all these different factions of the Brony fandom hated each other, united against each other, raised money over the weekend to pay all the show staff. And then they got it together and were like, we have too many PonyCons. We have to unite, we have to be careful. And a new department was created, the VIPR department. Now, while most cons at this point previously might have some green room or hospitality department, there has never been a department dedicated specifically to making sure the welfare of the guests were well treated. A lot of cons would just bring in guests, rush them through the gauntlet of going to panels during the signings, and if they're miserable, who cares? We have a big pool of guests to pull from for the next year. But PonyCons, again, they can't risk having one upset guest. So they had to treat them as they were made sure they weren't overworked, made sure they weren't overhandled. So a VIP department was created by the Pony Conventions, and eventually Anime Con, Furry Cons, and Sci-Fi Cons adapted some equivalent of a VIPR department, whether it's called guest relationship or green room department. This new concept became created, especially afterwards. DashCon happened, and of course we have all the things from TanaCon to Fire Festival. So if we want to avoid a Unicon, a DashCon, we need to have these different departments working in tandem with each other. A little bit of history that the money that you had to use to exchange for money in the dealer's hall, which I thought was kind of funny. Oops, it looks like I might be running a bit late. I just want to quickly summarize the last few chapters, which is there then became a point where everyone started wanting to create cons, and that became an issue. So this becomes a fight between the pro cons and the fan cons. Fan cons are non-profit, fan-run cons. People normally don't have experience working in the trade show or industry, but these are fans who just want to gather and make fun cons together. Pro cons, a lot of furry cons, anime cons started doing that. Then you had the other aspect where, oh, these cons are making a lot of money, let's buy them up. Wizard World, which was a comic magazine that specifically was there to report news on comics, shut off their main business, producing magazines, to start running cons. Wizard World bought Chicago Comic Con and turned it into Chicago World Con. Then all of a sudden you had ReedPop pop up, you had Left Field Media, you had these conglomerate companies buy up fan-run cons and then put their own branding on it. So there's been a fight. Fan-run cons seem to be smaller, more intimate. You could interact with the guests. It's a little bit more free-flowing. It's a little bit more organic. At the same time, there's a risk of them failing like Unicon or DashCon because these are not run by professionals. These are not run by paid individuals. These are run by volunteers who may be high school students who don't know what they're doing. At the same time, you have these pro cons that were run by people who were well-known in the industry, people who actually had trade show experience, but they sterilized everything down to simplification where, okay, you're in a line, you're getting an autograph, go. You're in a line, autograph, go. Panels, go, go, go. It became sterile, it became stripped down. People didn't like them. And a lot of fan cons refused to be bought up by these big conglomerates because they didn't want to lose that. Creative Con is a Star Trek con that was famously bought up and made into a pro con. And after seeing how bad Creative Con became, a lot of smaller fan-run Star Trek cons refused to move in that direction. Of course, DashCon, ball pit, the example. And then that leads to the next period where, of course, we have the idea of drama happening in the fandom. I would say one of the early dramas that started between what's called, I guess, the conservative elements and the liberal elements within fandoms were the Rabid and Sad Puppy Awards, block voting in science fiction cons, where Hugo Awards could be voted on at the science fiction cons. Of course, around the same time, Gamergate, Comiket happened. We had things like Vic Manola, who's been banned from a lot of the anime cons. So we had a period, and of course Rocky Mountain Fur Con, so we had a period where there's a lot of drama happening between these conventions. And that leads up to the final chapter of the book. This is where I think I'm going to end the book. What is the modern state of conventions? Where are things going to go? Now that a superhero movie has become the #1 thing, it is now big and advantageous to go to these conventions. People are wondering, is there a business behind these cons now? And there's a shift to pop culture being the mainstream. Now art and literature is seen as secondary as comic book movies have taken hold. So how are things going to get done? We see adaptations and stuff, and I guess I do have to wrap up, but this is where I think I'm going to end it. The very final BronyCon, which just happened this year, and of course Endgame being released, becoming the #1 movie of all time. This is where I'm going to leave things and predictions I'm going to write in this section. And I think that's basically where cons have ended up at this point. So we're seeing a shift to more pro-run cons, but now pop culture is dominant. So the people who control the cons might be the ones who control how media shifts. And with that, I thank you. Because I do have to wrap up the panel, that's it. But if not, you guys could gather some of my flyers here. You can also contact me on Twitter. I'm at Transformative Art on Twitter. You can also email me at conhistory@gmail.com. Very, very simple, conhistory@gmail.com. And with that, thank you very much for coming to my panel. I hope you guys enjoy it.
Thank you for all the hard work.
Unfortunately, I do have to clear up, but you guys are interested, we can chat outside. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the panel. A lot of work. This is like almost 7 years of work, and it's because I approached it from a different method, because I have a background in genetic evolution and biology. I try to approach conventions as if they were a living organism with a family tree, as opposed to just nebulous events.
Silver got to man bought me a coffee. Silver Gatoman, here is the song for thee. He likes to video all the panels at the cons. You should go and watch them whether they are short or long. Silver Gatoman, you video that's not a jibe. All of you go to his YouTube channel and like and subscribe.